Hello friends, welcome to CEC Gurukul Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk on theory of political representation and electoral system. Dear friends, in the previous three sessions we tried to give you more and more knowledge on political representation, and in this session too, first of all, we will talk about political representation in detail. We are going to talk on the models which we have initiated in the previous session, and we were discussing on the criticism of those models. So we are going to finish that first, and later on we are going to discuss on electoral system in detail, and we are going to discuss the different models regarding the electoral system. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is a prolific professor, and we are always delighted to have him in the studio. Friends, if you have any question pertaining to today's topic, feel free to talk to us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, once again, and would request him to give us more and more of knowledge. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetkaji, and good afternoon. Today is the fourth and the concluding session on our discussion on theories of political representation and electoral system. As we have been discussing over the last three lectures, the different ways and means through which this issue of representation and elections have been theorized and understood in discipline of political science in general and comparative politics in particular. In course of our discussion, we have had extensive discussion of some models of political representation, like the model which talks about the trusteeship model, the representative as trustee, then the representative as delegate, then the mandate model, largely after the advent of political parties, and the fourth model which I discussed under this resemblance model or politics of presence and descriptive representation. That is this entire discussion on group representation. Now, the way we have these four models of political representation, we have also different models of electoral system, and there is a very intricate relationship, intimate relationship between representation and electoral system. Because after all, in representative democracy or indirect democracy, this entire idea of representation gets translated into reality only through elections and electoral system. So therefore, the entire discussion of representation will remain incomplete unless the various models of electoral system are also discussed. So therefore, today we have to take into account these theories of electoral system. But before I proceed further in our discussion of this electoral system, in fact, I would like to recapitulate some of the issues related to group representation, which was the fourth model, because when we were referring to this group representation in our earlier discussion, the third part of our lecture series on this political representation, we discussed a few issues that how this group representation in recent years has become important way to understand this issue of equality in society, particularly intergroup equality, because this has been alleged that liberalism, which has been basically governing this entire discourse of representative democracy in modern time, was group blind, and therefore they didn't bother to look at this issue of equality from the point of view of the group and group aspirations and group representation. Therefore, this entire attack on this liberal worldview, which was called to be lauded in favor of individual rights and individual representation, has given rise to this entire discourse of group representation. This is what we were discussing. But at the same time, I also mentioned that group representation has had two different appearances, or one can say articulations, in the discipline of political science in 20th century. First of all, of course, this idea of group representation started much before these multiculturalist communitarians made appearance on the academic and intellectual horizon, and that was largely on account of the birth of a behavioral revolution, and along with that also this group perspective in politics, and therefore I had mentioned the name of Dahl, Ponsonby, and Bentley and Truman as the predecessors of Dahl and Ponsonby on this issue of group representation, because how they argued that in society power is dispersed, power is distributed and shared among various groups, and therefore Dahl's famous phraseology of polyarchy has to be kept in mind while discussing this group perspective on politics. And therefore they critique this elitist theory of power, which argued that power is monopolized by elites in society. This group theorists argued that power is evenly distributed among groups, and therefore they basically argued for a pluralist perspective on democracy and on politics. So this is how this group theory was initially brought into the discussion in the discipline of political science. At the same time, I also discussed consensusalism of Leffert, particularly the way he started talking about, the way he talked about power sharing in society among various groups, including the minorities, particularly in order to tide over the problem or the crisis of a majoritarian system. So therefore, this power sharing mechanism which Leffert argued through his consensual model and consensual theories. So these things predated, or one can say preceded, this entire multiculturalism and communitarianism, which brought a different perspective on this group politics or the group identity or the group rights and group representation in political science and comparative politics and political theory. So therefore, this is in this context that we are discussing the rise of this new perspective, that is on political representation, which is also called politics of presence. But at the same time, I had also mentioned that other theories of representation were the product of great revolutions in modern times. But the fourth model, that is basically the group representation, politics of presence, and the or descriptive representation, as Hannah Pitkin, one of the authority on political representation, calls it, is a product of social movements of 20th century, movements of women's, movements of the ethnic groups, minorities, oppressed nationalities, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the fourth model is a product of social movement. And it is in this context I was mentioning some of the leading voices on group representation. And along with that, I also mentioned some of the special features of this theory. For example, I mentioned that how they theorize, how they basically problematize the issue of experience, and to the extent that many people call it they offer an experiential theory of knowledge and epistemology. In fact, the feminist theory is credited for creating a new perspective that is called a standpoint epistemology. And this epistemology is basically factorized or brought into the discussion on their when they argue for special rights and special representations for women in society as a group. So therefore, these are some of the theoretical nuances of this entire theory which we are looking at. At the same time, I also talked about the two representative thinkers on this group representation, or one can say the politics of presence, or one can say this microcosm representation as they call it. One is Kamlika, the Canadian political scientist, political theorist, who has been talking about this group representation through his writings, particularly from the frame of communitarianism. And therefore, when Kamlika, I mentioned that talked of two types of representation, one for national minorities, another for disadvantaged ethnic groups, which include gender and many racial groups in society. And for these national minorities, as I mentioned, which for Kamlika include Aboriginal people, the Franco-Quebecers and others, Kamlika argue for right to self-government or self-determination. And therefore, in fact, that is perhaps the argument he puts forth, so far as in order to defend their rights, in order to ensure their representation in politics. Whereas the another category, disadvantaged groups, be it gender or other racial groups, Kamlika stops short of this argument for self-government or self-determination or self-rule, and he only argues for special measures to overcome the systemic hurdles on their path of development and progress, and in order to bring equality in a group-blind political process. So this is how Ambedkar does it. But I also mentioned that Maurice Young, particularly in his famous book Justice and the Politics of Difference, in fact disagrees with this perspective of Ambedkar, because he is another very important voice on this issue of group representation, particularly a feminist voice. And she is basically quite wary of this right to self-determination claim of groups, because she feels that that will foment nationalistic sentiments, and that will not augur well for democracy. And therefore, Young's major concern is for a special group representation to ensure, the presence of alternative perspectives to a heterogeneous public, in order to, bring multiple perspectives on the table for decision making and for politics. So therefore, it is a different take on this issue. And when she talks of multiple perspective, coming in a public sphere, or one can say in a heterogeneous public, one is here reminded of John Stuart Mill's famous argument that how all opinions, all shades of opinion need representation. And therefore, in fact, he argued for minority representation, but also, of course, John Stuart Mill argued in his own framework, with his own set of argument. But nonetheless, this argument of Young is fundamentally different from what Ambedkar says, and therefore these two representative voices I had discussed in detail in our last lecture. But at the same time, I had also mentioned that this group representation ultimately comes to the issue of multiple ways, particular electoral means and ways through which this idea of group equality in society could be translated into action. And it is here that Melissa William, as I mentioned, that talks about number of measures which can be thought of, which can be brought into discussion, which will basically ensure intergroup parity and intergroup equality, including proportional representation system, the provision for reserved seats, redrawing the electoral boundaries, if concentration, in order to ensure the concentration of certain minorities and disadvantaged groups in certain constituencies, which is also called redistricting or gerrymandering, quota in the party candidates, particularly while setting up during elections, then veto, and a number of weightage, parity, etc. These are the measures which are basically discussed and talked about in order to ensure group representation. And all these measures are somehow related to electoral system. So therefore, what we find that this entire discussion, which is initiated by this group representation theorists, ultimately comes to merge with this discussion of the theories of electoral system, that what type of electoral system is best suited to ensure group equality in society. But the theories of electoral system is not only confined to this issue, that is intergroup equality and parity, which is the concern of this group theories, but rather theories of electoral system are very much there, because as I mentioned, this idea of representation becomes a reality only through electoral process. And therefore, from the very beginning, after this democracy made a transition from direct to indirect, these theories of electoral system have been there, be it majoritarian system or the proportional representation system. The only a chance that these group theorists or theorists of group representation have been reposing faith on a particular model of electoral system in order to ensure group equality in society. So this is how ultimately this entire discussion shifts to the terrain of theories of electoral system. But before I start discussing the various theories of electoral system and various other issues related to electoral system, we also have to look at some of the criticisms which are basically leveled against this group theorists on political representation, or one can say the politics of presence, which is basically which we were discussing earlier. The first important charge against them is that their theory leads to balkanization of society. Society is balkanized along various groups, and therefore the kind of unanimity, kind of oneness which is sometimes required for democratic engagement is not possible. Another important criticism which is leveled against them is that they violate the democratic principle of individual equality and overemphasize perhaps the group disparity and the group advantage, and therefore individual rights, individual equality and individual freedom is sacrificed at the altar of this group perspective and the group rights. The third important criticism is that of essentialism, that they essentialize group identities, as if within groups, various social groups, there are not other contradictions, there are not other inequalities, there are not other stratifications. For example, women as a group are also divided among rich and poor, educated and uneducated, along various other identity markers. So is the case with other ethnic groups. So therefore, what they do, that in order to put forth their argument, in order to argue out their case, they essentialize these identities. They essentialize identities by picking up one particular marker, identity marker, and then they argue that perhaps this is the marker around which their identity should be understood and the rights should be devolved to them on basis of that particular marker. At the same time, the criticism is also that they simply heighten, or one can say augment, the kind of stigmatization which certain oppressed groups carry in society, and therefore instead of erasing those stigmatized markers, they try to simply fetishize them, they simply reify them, and they simply make them a matter of social value. And so therefore this stigmatization criticism is also leveled against them. And then of course the most important criticism is that minority within minority. They talk of minorities, they talk of disadvantaged groups, oppressed groups, but they simply ignore that in every disadvantaged group there are various types of minority. Minority on basis of different markers, on basis of social, economic, cultural, and therefore those minorities lose their voice, because what happens that within every group a dominant voice emerges, and that dominant voice becomes the voice of the group. But whereas other voices get completely submerged. So therefore, what happens that when they ignore these individual rights and individual identity, then what happens that this phenomenon of minority within minority is also it also gets ignored, and ultimately it leads to the dominance of certain dominant voices, dominant sections, dominant identities within every group at the cost of certain marginal and one can say disadvantaged groups. So therefore minority within minority aspect is not basically addressed through this theory. So this is how this the group representation theory has been criticized. Now coming to this issue of electoral system. Now this electoral system, theories of electoral system is a very important issue, and I have seen that even the group theorists, even the politics of presence ultimately has to fall back on these theories of electoral system to realize their vision of group equality in society. So how these theories are to be understood? What are the elections all about? What is the purpose of elections? How elections are organized and for what purpose? What are the basically purpose of electoral system? Whether the purpose is to provide effective government or the purpose is to provide a representative government, and can both be combined together? And what is basically the experience of last few centuries in modern times, because there are different polities, there are different constitutionalism, there are different constitutional arrangements, and they have used different electoral theories to translate this idea of representation into reality. Because representation, as I mentioned, and rights have been the major demands of all revolutionaries in modern times. Rather, these two things have been the central issues in all revolutions, rights and representation. So therefore this representation issue, which gets translated into reality through election, has to be understood more properly. Now it is here we should also remember that elections are not the sufficient conditions, but definitely the necessary conditions for representation. One cannot say that if you have a foolproof electoral system, then one can be very happy that representations, ideals, and representational aspirations of people have been met. That cannot happen. But nonetheless, it is a necessary condition. In a representative democracy, only through electoral system that this aspiration can basically be materialized. So that is one thing, in fact, we should remember and we should keep in mind. But the second thing is that debate in recent decades and years has basically become very intense on this issue, particularly from 2 points of view. One, when ballot is cast during election, and number 2, what happens after ballot is cast and for till next election your representative rules. And both things to some extent are related to electoral system, but the first is directly related to electoral system, the second is related to representative model or model of representation. So therefore these two issues have been attracting the attention or drawing the attention of scholars and political scientists. Now, as I mentioned earlier also, that Schumpeter, one of a very eminent voice on democracy, in fact he called election as the heart of democracy, and therefore he believed that without election perhaps democracy cannot be thought of. In fact, he went to the extent of saying that purpose of election is not to create a representative who will carry out the will of the people, but rather the purpose of election is simply to enable to help in formation of government, and therefore once that purpose is served, then electoral system can be considered to be successful in its mission. Now, what are the different functions of election? That is perhaps one issue which comes to one's mind when one discusses theories of electoral system. The first important function is the recruitment of politics, recruitment in politics. Only through elections the elites are inducted into the political arena. It is only through elections that representatives are elected and chosen to discharge their governmental and political responsibility. The second important function of election is the formation of government, as perhaps Schumpeter also alluded to. The third important function is, to just realize this ideal of representation, and fourth, of course, is in terms of influencing the policy making process. And of course, at the same time, the other functions of election are no less important. For example, educating the voters about their rights, about their duties, about the political system, about the political process, about the responsibilities of the representatives, and then also building the legitimacy of a system in democracy. As it is well known, in those polities, in those democratic polities where elections are not very regular, where elections are sometimes ignored, the government or the system, political system, ultimately suffers from a legitimacy deficit, and therefore this legitimacy, supplying legitimacy to the system, is the important work of electoral system. And therefore these are essentially, one can say, the functions of electoral system or the elections in democracy. Now, of course, there are a number of debates and controversies. In fact, one is the debate between candidates and parties. Through elections, whom do you consider more important, parties or the candidates? And it is here we should remember that this party and candidate thing we have already touched upon, particularly when the mandate model of representation we were discussing, that after advent of political parties, the candidates, their individualities, their commitment to constituencies have totally been ignored. Then of course there are other issues which are also debated. For example, the single candidate versus preferences, then electoral units versus constituencies, and then one member versus multi-member constituencies, plurality versus quota, and all these issues will come up in course of our discussion on the theories of electoral system. But one thing we should remember, that this entire electoral system is largely divided into two types. One is the majoritarian system, which is also called plurality system, where one is elected on basis of the majority of votes cast. Majority of votes one candidate gets out of all the votes cast, and the plurality. For example, if only 60% voters have cast vote in the constituency, and it is a contest among multiple candidates, a candidate even getting the highest percentage of votes, which could be 16, 15, 20, anything, but it will not be the majority of the votes of the constituency. Even in that case, he or she can get elected, and therefore it is called plurality system. Plurality of votes one gets and gets elected, and therefore it is often alleged that this basically is a majoritarian system. It favors some political parties, rather big political parties. It is disadvantageous to small political parties. In fact, to the extent that there is one political theorist, Brian Barry, he says that it also disenfranchises large number of voters in the constituencies. For example, everyone's preference does not get translated into the political, political decision making, in the sense that every preference is not making its appearance on the political horizon. So therefore, there are a number of criticisms which we will be looking at shortly, particularly from the point of view of this majoritarian system, which is also called first past the post system, and this is perhaps one of the oldest. In fact, United Kingdom practices it. It is practiced in even United States of America. It is practiced in India, particularly in the elections of the lower house of this parliament. It is practiced in number of countries. In fact, there is a background, there is a history of this evolution of this system, which is largely territorial, and this thing is basically related to the modern times, particularly this quest for representation, no taxation without representation, the famous slogan, and therefore the taxpayers were divided into territorial units, and therefore this idea of representation first of all made appearance through such units, territorial units, and this plurality system. But in course of time, number of new mechanisms were thought of, number of innovations were made, and therefore now most of the theories of electoral system are divided between two categories. The majoritarian system, that is called first past the post system, and the proportional representation system, and therefore within these two there are many variants. At least within the proportional representation there are many variations. So we will be looking at some of the variations within proportional representation system. But one thing we should remember before we proceed further, that this majoritarian system, that is a first past the post system, as I mentioned, has certain disadvantages for the smaller parties, and also it leads to certain political tendencies in society. For example, scholars believe, particularly Duverger, a great theorist of party system, there is a Duverger's law, which says that first past the post system, that is majoritarian system, leads to two-party system and one-party dominance, and therefore it also is disadvantageous to smaller parties who have a support base spread over the whole territorial boundaries of the nation. Whereas the bigger parties have concentrated support, geographical concentration of support, and therefore it advantages to them. So therefore this is Duverger's law so far as this majoritarian system is concerned, that is first past the post system, that it can result into two-party system and one-party government. Of course, there are also exceptions to this law. For example, India has defied Duverger's law. India has this majoritarian system, that is first past the post system. But India didn't witness two-party system from the very beginning. But there have been multiple parties, and therefore Indian situation is a multi-party system. And many scholars argue that even in Canada, this Duverger's law has been defied. But nonetheless, Duverger's argument makes a lot of sense when you discuss this majoritarian system or the first past the post system, because this tendency is definitely there and it cannot be ignored. So therefore this is something we should remember when you discuss the theories of electoral system. Now coming to some questions which often come or one strike one the moment one discusses this entire theories of electoral system. The first question is that which offices posts are open to elections? What elections ultimately do in terms of filling the offices? What offices? In fact, the answer is very simple, that those offices who have importance in policy making, or one can say that offices which carry some responsibility, special responsibility in democracy, and normally they are legislature and executive. But one thing we should remember, that there are some countries in Europe where even the judges are elected, so even judiciary is part of this electoral process, not only legislature and executive. The next question which also comes is, who are entitled to vote in elections? So therefore, eligibility criteria in election, the voting criteria. Of course, one thing we should know that this universal adult franchise, as we are familiar in India, is not a very old phenomenon in politics. In fact, we should remember that after only a suffrage movement, that women could get the right to vote. In fact, India to some extent is an exception, that at the beginning of its democratic journey, it gave a universal adult franchise and right to vote to everyone, irrespective of their social, economic and other identities. Whosoever was adult was given this right. So universal adult franchise is basically a new phenomenon in world politics. One can say the politics of various democratic countries. Now one thing is there, that this franchise, the issue of franchise, that who ultimately is eligible to vote, has always been has been put under restrictions, and the restrictions have been along four important criteria. One is the property, the second is education, third is gender, as I mentioned that women were not enfranchised, and the fourth was racial, which continued till recently in South Africa till 1990 when apartheid regime was there. And it is interesting to also remember that India itself during colonial period, the franchise was highly restricted. In fact, property, education, these were the criteria for franchise, for voting. The voters were basically eligible on basis of this thing. But of course, even some informal restrictions sometimes are also in vogue in some countries. For example, the provision for registration, that you are a citizen or you are basically a voter as per the criteria or the norms laid down, you automatically don't become a voter and you cannot cast your vote. You have to register yourself. If you fail to register, then you are basically losing your voting right. And this is perhaps in the United States of America in some of the states. And therefore, here the option lies with the voters, that you have to register yourself. But if for some reason if you fail to register, then you also lose your voting right. So therefore, it is an informal restrictions. But nonetheless, one can call it is a restriction. Whereas there are some countries where there is a provision for compulsory voting, that everyone has a compulsory obligation to turn up on the polling booths and to vote. And if they fail to discharge this duty, then there is a penal action which can also follow. In fact, in India itself, this debate started few years ago, that should we go for a compulsory voting, because after this percentage of voters started falling, participation was a major concern, particularly in cities. So therefore, of course, we should also remember that India offers a very mixed signals, because on the one hand, the percentage of voters has been growing in countryside to the extent that many political scientists have called it second democratic upsurge. Particularly, the massive participation of Dalits, OBCs, minorities, women, and other disprivileged and oppressed sections of society. So therefore, particularly disprivileged sections of society. So they call it second democratic upsurge. But at the same time, it was also witnessed that in cities, the participation was not very satisfactory. So this debate started, that should we go for compulsory voting on the pattern of Australia, Belgium, Italy, and some other countries which practices this, this compulsory voting, during elections. So these are some of the rest, issues which are also related on who is eligible to vote, who is basically qualified to vote. The next question, which can also be asked here when we discuss theories of electoral system, that how votes are cast. In fact, of course, there are two ways. The public voting, which is not very common. It was in operation in erstwhile Soviet Union, particularly till 89. In fact, even now in some smaller organizations, one can see such thing happening. By raising the hands, one can see that voting process or electoral process, is conducted. But nonetheless, the most dominant form of election and electoral, practice is the secret ballot, vote through secret ballots. And here, one can say that it is an Australian innovation, and therefore it is at times is also called Australian ballot, because it was for the first time used in the South Australia in 1856. So therefore, the secret ballot is considered to be one of the important guarantees for fair election. That if the secrecy principle is violated, then at times the question on the fairness is also raised. And that brings to the question of electoral fairness. That of course election is important for representation, for giving vent to people's aspiration, opening a channel for people's aspirations, but nonetheless, how to ensure fairness in this type of competitive milieu in society, when basically the society is always divided among various sectionalities, the affluent and the poor, privileged and disprivileged, oppressed and not oppressed, along gender and other axes. So therefore, how to ensure this electoral fairness? And therefore, in fact, of course, secret ballot, as I mentioned, is a very important mechanism, but only secret ballot cannot guarantee fairness, because there are a lot of factors which can influence voting, which can vitiate this entire electoral process, which can affect the fairness associated with electoral process. For example, corruption and intimidation is a very important factor in society, which can be considered. In India, of course, this issue is debated very often, that how electoral process can be made quite fair and transparent. And the role of election commission here has been commendable in this respect. In fact, from introducing electronic voting machine to making number of changes and number of amendments in People's Representation Act of 1951, including some of its measures which have been also endorsed by the Supreme Court, including the provision for affidavit by candidates detailing the charges and the cases or the criminal cases against them, their property declaration, and many other things which Election Commission has been making in order to bring fairness to this electoral process in India, so that the voters should know in advance that what type of candidate they are going to vote for. And therefore, there should not be any dearth of information. They should be in possession of all informations regarding the candidates who are in the electoral fray, and then they should take an informed decision on that. So therefore, corruption and intimidation. Then of course, voters' access to reliable and the balanced information. This is very important, and therefore in India particularly, this right to information is playing a very important role. Then of course, how to enable the voters to have all the choices on offer, at least information about all the choices on offer. Then of course, the campaign and the money factor, which is very important, because it is also alleged that through elections, the consent is manufactured. And there are a lot of theoretical debates taking place on this issue, that how in modern representative democracies, consent is largely manufactured through number of instruments, including media, which at times basically is corporate owned, and therefore the phenomenon of paid news is a kind of hurdle on the path of fairness of election and the smooth discharge of democratic functions of a polity. So therefore, this campaign, money factor, paid news and media, and it is something related to this that we can discuss, that how in India today, there is a great debate on the funding of elections, because contesting election is becoming going out of reach of the ordinary people, because the kind of resources which are required, and therefore even among political parties there are a lot of unevenness, or one can say disproportionately they are divided in terms of their resources. Of course, there is no direct corporate funding. It was banned in India in way back in late 60s, but of course there are number of recommendations of Election Commission, number of recommendations of Law Commission. Even the court has looked at this issue. Recently we have heard about this electoral bonds, and number of things are in circulation and under debate. So this state funding, that all political parties should be funded by the state, so that level playing ground is given to all political players, and therefore there is no discrimination, there is no unevenness, there is no disparity among the political players in terms of the resources they have at their command. So therefore these are some of the issues where basically electoral fairness is to be kept in mind, because when we talk of theories of electoral system, that theory only deals with that how votes are to be cast and how the candidate is to be elected. But there are many related issues, and those issues we are discussing at the moment. Of course, we will come to this various theories of electoral system through which this casting of vote and ballot is also basically arranged and organized. Then the counting of votes, how to count the votes, and this is very important. At times, allegations are leveled, that the elections have been rigged, they have not been fair. Even in United States of America, we could see in 1998 that this voting and the counting became a major issue. So therefore, and here this initiative of Election Commission in India of electronic voting machine, which is of course recently debated that how fair it is. There are many allegations regarding its fairness also, but nonetheless these are some of the mechanisms through which this is ensured. The next issue comes, is the mode of election. Before I move to this issue of the ballot, how ballot is cast, how this electoral thing is organized and arranged, we have to look at this modes of election, that how elections are to be organized. One is the single candidate election, which is normally happens in the territorial constituencies with majoritarian system, first past the post system, against this preferential voting, where of course it can be territorial, it can be non-territorial, it can be electoral units, not the constituencies, and where the voters are supposed to give their preferences, order their preferences in terms of a kind of hierarchical arrangement. Then electoral units and the constituencies, as I mentioned, that both ways this can be done. People can be clubbed as electoral units irrespective of the territorial location, or they can be organized on basis of the constituencies and their territorial location, geographical location. Then single member and multi-member. This is another very common mode of organizing elections. Then of course plurality and the absolute majority. And there are systems, electoral systems, in which one can get elected only after one crosses the absolute majority mark. And therefore, we will be discussing that there is a system, second ballot runoff model, where you have the first time if no one crosses the majority mark, absolute majority, then the lower candidates, the candidates who are lower in terms of the number of votes they have gained, are eliminated, and only two candidates for two candidates, second ballot is used, second ballot is given to voters. It is called runoff election, and out of two one has to get the majority of votes. So therefore, there are different modes through which these elections are organized. Of course, most of them gets divided into two categories, that is majoritarian and the proportional representation system, and this is what we have to discuss. Now, majoritarian system, as I was mentioning earlier, is also called first past the post system, and therefore, as I discussed in the very beginning with reference to Duverger, that it privileges or it is advantageous to the large parties because how high proportion of seats they normally get, the bigger parties, compared to their vote share in the constituency. For example, United Kingdom, it is often argued that single party government was formed from 1945 to 2010, and this was largely on account of this practice of this majoritarian system, that is first past the post system, whereas proportional representation system guarantees equal relationship between the seats won by a party and also the votes gained in the election. There is a clear-cut parity between the two. For example, if a party gets 45% votes during election, then the percentage of seats it would get would also be in the same proportion, that is 45%. So 45% votes and 45% seats. So this type of neat equal relationship between the vote share and the seat share is the hallmark of this PR system. Now, of course, one thing we should remember, and I mentioned earlier also, that there are disadvantages also of this proportional representation system, that is PR system. Of course, this parity between seat share and vote share is there, no one can deny, and therefore it is argued that it is more tilting in direction of representation. It is more representative system than perhaps majoritarian system, that is first past the post system. But at the same time, there are certain weaknesses are there. In fact, there are certain disadvantages which cannot be ignored. For example, it leads to coalition politics, and in fact it also leads to not a very effective government, rather weak government, because sometimes one party government is not possible under proportional representation system. So therefore, the coalition governments are often considered to be weak government, and therefore it is not effective government but a representative government. Now the debate surfaces on this issue, that which is more important, effective government or representative government. If the purpose of democracy is representative government, then we shouldn't bother that how effective government is, at least in terms of giving representational aspirations a clear-cut voice. Proportional representation is discharging a great work, and therefore it can be considered more democratic than the majoritarian system. But at the same time, we should also remember that democracy also requires an effective deliverance of social political goods, and that effective deliverance requires effective government. So therefore, these are the issues which are still debated. There is no final word on this. In fact, when India's constitution was being drafted, a lot of issues related to India's electoral system best suited for India came up. And in fact, one should remember the famous speech of B.R. Ambedkar, chairman of the drafting committee, the last speech which was he delivered while winding up the debate on the draft constitution. And he said that till now we don't have any theory which combines both a responsible government and a stable government. The government which is more responsible may not be stable, but a government which is stable may not be responsible. So one has to settle for one thing. Now, if one goes deeper in this spirit of this speech of B.R. Ambedkar, then one finds that perhaps this representation and effective government immediately comes to one mind the moment one discusses PR system and this majoritarian first past the post system. And I would like to mention here that in Constituent Assembly, there was a time when many minority groups were advocating proportional representation system, particularly after partition. Muslim League leaders who remained in India and became part of Constituent Assembly, they kept arguing after a reservation for minorities was withdrawn in 1949, that reservation has gone, separate electorate has gone, but please ensure that India goes for proportional representation. a PR system. This is how the minority voices will be adequately represented in the political arena. But nonetheless, Indian constitution settled for a different model of electoral system, that is basically first past the post system, because they were quite wary of this ineffective governance and the phenomenon of coalition politics in proportional representation system. So therefore, they didn't entertain this argument. Now, one thing is to be borne in mind, that there is nothing called the best electoral system. Every polity goes according to its own situation. In fact, what is more important is that how one assesses the ground reality. In fact, there are advantages with the majoritarian system. There are advantages with the proportional representation system. As I mentioned, that on a scale of representation, PR system weighs higher than perhaps the majoritarian system. Now, of course, this majoritarian system distorts people's preferences. It is unfair to smaller parties. In fact, particularly the parties which are evenly distributed in different geographical areas in the country. And the parties which have a geographically concentrated support base, they basically gain it. So therefore, these are some of the issues we should keep in mind when we discuss this preferential voting system, this proportional representation system, and this majoritarian system. Now, coming to this issue of electoral system, which I was mentioning, that there are different modes through which these elections are organized, and there are at least 5 important mechanisms. The first one is, as I mentioned, the first past the post system, which is a single member plurality system, where the plurality of votes decide the loss or the win of the candidate. The second is the second ballot system. It is also called runoff system or runoff ballot system. As I was mentioning, that the leading 2 candidates ultimately remain in the fray, and the single it is often possible in a single member constituency, not in a multi-member constituency, and the single choice voting. And ultimately what happened, that the second ballot is given, other candidates are eliminated, and ultimately one has to win on basis of the plurality votes, but of course cross the majority mark. The third is the alternative vote system, AB system, or it is also sometimes called the supplementary vote. Now, of course, again it is possible in a single member constituency, and it is preferential voting, unlike the other 2 systems. And here what happens, that this supplementary voting system, that only single supplementary vote is happening, and 50% votes cast will enable a candidate to win. And of course, the counting is also done on basis of preferential basis. And what happens, that the bottom candidates from the bottom, in terms of the vote share or the votes gained, they are eliminated one by one, and therefore their votes are redistributed of his voters, particularly the second choice exercise on their ballots, until one gets the majority. So what happened, that in order to cross this majority mark, the votes are distributed from those candidates who are at the bottom in terms of their vote share, and the second preferences made on their ballots are distributed, and then it is basically ensured that on basis of this distribution of the second preferences, whosoever crosses the majority mark gets elected. So this is called alternative vote system. The fourth is, in fact, of course, this I earlier mentioned that the France has been practicing number of electoral systems and has been changing it. Many countries have introduced new thing and changed it. So this change, trial and error thing goes on among various countries. But these things happen, out of these 4-5 options available so far as theories of electoral system is concerned. The fourth is the mixed member proportional system. In fact, it is also called additional member system, either MMP or AMS. MMP is the mixed member proportional system, or additional member system. And what happens that again it is a single member constituency, but interestingly this is not purely single member constituency, but within a constituency, within this voting process, some constituencies are single member and some constituencies are based on the party list system, where the voter does not give vote to candidate, but voter gives vote to the party, and the party decides a list of candidates, puts the list of candidates before the voters, and the voters have to exercise their choices out of that list set up by the party. Sometimes there are two types of list, open list and the closed list. Party decides the candidates and leaves it to the voters to decide the ordering, that which out of 5 or 4 or 6 candidates it is considering number 1, 2, 3. That is called open list system. Then there is also provision for closed list system, where the party itself decides the ordering of candidates, that who is number 1 and who is number 2 and who is number 3. So therefore, this mixed member proportional system is a combination of two, the single member constituencies as well as the party list system. And every voter having 2 votes, one for the constituency election and another for the party list candidate. So this is called mixed member proportional system or additional number system, additional member system. The 5th is single transferable vote, or it is called preferential voting. It is often a multi-member constituency where the candidates number could be 3 to 8, and in fact there is a quota for elections. One has to cross the quota in order to get elected. In fact, this is what we find in India in Rajya Sabha, in the election of president, vice president, and so on and so forth. And the last is the party list system, where there is only one provision, not the mixed one where you have the constituency and the party list both. Here only the party list system, and some of the European countries practices where the voters vote for the party list. Either it is open list or the closed list. So therefore, these are some of the models of electoral system through which this idea of representation is translated into reality in modern times. And this is how this debate and the discourse on the two issues happen in political science and comparative politics.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in if you have any question or if you wish to give your feedback. Today, we are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again soon and we would be discussing on another topic. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.
Thank you.